All right, so welcome back. So at least the last little thing we're going to be looking at with the autonomic nervous system is the other branch, the sympathetic nervous system, and in more specifics, the actual receptors for that division. So we talked about last time that these are in that class of monoamines, those biogenic amines. So we're talking about epinephrine, norepinephrine, dopamine, serotonin are the main ones that fall in that class. What we're looking at here is really those ones that are adrenaline or epinephrine, norepinephrine, if you want to kind of go with that one. These bind to what are called adrenergic receptors. What we're going to see is there's actually two main subtypes and then subclasses within those. So what we're going to see is we have alpha and beta receptors that are adrenergic receptors. And we're actually going to see there is a subclass in each of those. So what we're going to see is we're going to have alpha 1s and alpha 2s and beta 1s and beta 2s. So alpha 1 receptors are typically stimulatory. So we see these in a lot of smooth muscle cells. These are going to stimulate muscle contraction, so some type of vasoconstriction, the muscles in your skin, those erector pili muscles, uterine contraction, the ureters, these are all things that are going to stimulate alpha 1 receptors. If you've ever heard of Flomax that you sometimes see on TV, it is an alpha 1 receptor blocker. So it helps keep the urethral sphincter open more. So it allows somebody with prostate issues, it gives them an easier time emptying their bladder, is an example of an alpha 1 blocker, for example. So these would lead to vasoconstriction. Alpha 2, not a lot of these ones. These are in the pancreas. They inhibit insulin secretion, involved a little bit with sphincters within the GI tract, and are involved in the blood clotting process. Beta 1s are the other kind of main one here. The beta receptors, we're going to see the beta 2 receptors are our other big one. Beta 1s are stimulatory as well. These increase the heart rate and force, also stimulate renin secretion, which would increase blood pressure in the kidneys. Where beta 2s, and this is where it's kind of interesting, you can get a norepinephrine response. We saw the alpha 1s would lead to vasoconstriction. Same hormone being released. If it binds to a beta 2 receptor, it leads to vasodilation. So these are primarily inhibitory. Smooth muscles of the heart, liver, skeletal muscle leads to smooth muscle relaxation, and vessel dilation leads to bronchodilation in the lungs, opens all that up. Relaxes the smooth muscle in the bladder, in the as well as the urinary tract. And the thinking on this one is if you don't want your beta receptors or blood vessels in general, you don't want all of them necessarily dropping. So when you're going to be fight or flight response, you want skeletal muscle to get a lot of blood to it, because the fight or flight response, you're going to want good blood delivery to your skeletal muscle, to your heart. One of the ways to do that is to open up the blood vessels to those areas, but you can't have all your blood vessels acting on an on-off switch with these beta receptors. So in order to maintain blood pressure, we open up the vessels that are going to the skeletal muscle, going to the heart, but at the same time, the ones that are binding to those alpha 1s, which are a lot of the other blood vessels, are going to vasoconstrict those, which is going to help maintain the pressure through those parts of the blood supply system, the vessel system, so we can then open up the blood supply to those skeletal muscles without dropping blood pressure too much that you lose consciousness. So again, to me, kind of a neat one here. This is one of those responses that you don't see too often in the body, where same hormone can lead to exactly opposite responses depending upon receptor subtype. So alpha 1s, vasoconstriction, beta 2s, smooth muscle relaxation. The other place you would have heard of beta receptors and some of the stuff with that is if you've ever heard of beta blockers. So these are one of the main heart drugs that you see a lot of times in response to blood pressure. Beta blockers are beta 1 receptor blockers, and if we go back to the beta 1s here, if you decrease the heart rate and decrease the force of the beating of the heart, you're going to decrease blood pressure, along with blocking renin secretion, which we'll get into in the vessels and blood pressure regulation. But again, the beta blockers are another example of something acting on the autonomic system, like I gave the example with Flomax on the alpha 1s. It's just another example of how drugs can target some of this some of the time to help maintain the body. So again, beta 1 receptors increase heart rate, increase production of renin in the kidney, which is going to lead to increased blood pressure and vasoconstriction. And we can kind of see the combination of these here on the sympathetic and parasympathetic pathways. So you can see parasympathetic wise, the first one going to the ganglion synapse here, you have acetylcholine being released, stimulatory nicotinic receptors taking this down, and generally the target cells are going to have these muscarinic receptors present, which can be stimulatory or inhibitory depending upon what we're talking about. Where the sympathetic pathways, you can see acetylcholine again being released at the ganglion to nicotinic receptors. When we start talking about most of the effects of this, we're going to get norepinephrine on the postsynaptic neuron being released, going to adrenergic receptors, which could be alpha 1s, alpha 2s, beta 1s, beta 2s. Every once in a while, certain ones here are going to be these muscarinic receptors, which are just in a few specific target areas, and I would say don't focus on them too much, but know that they exist. And again, most of this is dual innervation, and a lot of times we're stimulating these to some level, so there is some type of autonomic tone, so we have the ability to tone it up or tone it down and not just on-off. That is true in most cases, but there is certain things like sweat glands are more of an on-off than somewhere in the middle, and you're turning them down or turning them up. And again, it's helpful there. If you want to do regulation, if you had the blood vessels fully constricted or fully dilated, you only have one direction to go, which means you can't deal with a lot of different things. If you're somewhere in the middle and providing some tone, it means you can tone it down or tone it up based on what the need is there by either dilating it more or constricting it more. And again, we've talked about these being antagonistic effects, so usually antagonistic. So parasympathetic would slow the heart rate, sympathetic would increase the heart rate. GI tract, same thing. Parasympathetic would stimulate the contraction and the motility. Sympathetic would inhibit that. Again, these cells have both those types of receptors that allow these actions to happen. Pupillary muscles on the iris, parasympathetic leads to pupillary constriction. Sympathetic leads to pupillary dilation. So again, antagonistic effects. We talked about already a little bit, sympathetic and parasympathetic in male and female sexual response tend to work together. And again, this just kind of go through antagonistic effects and pupil size. You can see this little question again here. We do see kind of some of these on-off with certain blood vessels, certain sweat glands. There is really either an on-off with the sympathetic and just that's it. We also see kind of the on-off with going to the cells of the adrenal gland, which we would see would further increase epinephrine and norepinephrine release, and we'll get into that more in the endocrine system. So really the last little bit here is taking a look at some of these different effects, and I don't expect you to know all 4 pages of this. This is just kind of showing you the sympathetic versus the parasympathetic effect. And you can kind of see generally they are opposing effects. We see some cases where there is no innervation. So sweat glands stimulate sweat glands with the sympathetic, no innervation with the sweat glands and the parasympathetic. Ciliary muscle in the eye, parasympathetic, stimulates it, no innervation with the sympathetic. But you can see outside of that is generally opposing reactions where you see stimulates, inhibits. Stimulates constriction, stimulates dilation. Decreases heart rate, increases heart rate. Constricts, dilates. You can see most of these are opposite effects. And you can look through the list a little bit more and take a look at all those. You can see with the male and female reproductive parts here, you can see that it is a combination effect here. They work together in that case. And again, just having a basic understanding of this list is fine. I'm not going to give you all of these and say what goes on here, but you should have some basic ideas of about what the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system would be doing. And again, last one here. There is some kind of interesting, weird sympathetic ones here where you sometimes it's like a abnormality here. Raynaud syndrome is an example of this, where you get like almost an overactive sympathetic response and you get too much vasoconstriction in the fingers, and you will get this almost white fingers and pain in the fingers in the cold or stress. It tends to be more common in women, but it's an overactive sympathetic response. There is also some autonomic plexuses. We're going to have some of the sympathetic and parasympathetic pre- and postganglionic axons that are going to have some branching that does do some plexuses here. I'm not going to get really into those too much, but it does happen. So you see with the autonomic, you have a cardiac plexus, a pulmonary plexus, esophageal. Again, just understanding that these exist. I really don't get deep into this, talking about differences between like the cardiac plexus and the pulmonary plexus, but these are kind of getting into where some of that branching and what are some of the effects that the autonomic nervous system has on these areas. There's also some autonomic reflexes. So with smooth muscle contraction, cardiac muscle contraction, these are mediated, like it says there, by autonomic reflex arcs in response to a stimulus. So cardiovascular reflex, if you get too much blood vessel wall due to blood pressure increase, too much stretching, you're going to get an inhibition of the sympathetic nervous system, activation of the parasympathetic nervous system to the heart, and try to decrease the pressure from the heart so you're not overstretching these blood vessels, as an example of an autonomic reflex. Same thing you can see with the gastrointestinal reflexes here. Certain things here will, sight of smell or food can trigger the parasympathetic nervous system to get more active, cause increased secretion by the stomach. Control the rectum as well, parasympathetic, causing contraction to help aid in getting rid of your fecal material. Micturition reflex, again, you need that parasympathetic nervous system to allow relaxation of certain sphincters, and then contraction of that detrusor muscle, which is the muscle of the bladder wall. All this is controlled by the autonomic nervous system and leads into this reflexive action. You relax the external sphincter, allows the parasympathetic to relax that internal sphincter, as well as contract the muscles of the smooth muscle, the bladder wall, that will lead to urination or micturition if you want to go the more scientific way. And again, there's also a lot of these other ones here with pupillary diameter and other stuff like that. That would be some of these examples of some autonomic reflexes. So, and again, this is really finishes up our nervous system stuff. Again, to me, with the parasympathetic and sympathetic, understanding the rest and digest, fight, flight differences, some of the basic differences in what is going on in those systems with specificity, those kind of antagonistic effects. And to me, the other thing I can really ask about is a lot about the different receptor subtypes and kind of examples and what they're doing a little bit. So the muscarinic versus nicotinic receptors and the alpha and beta receptors when it comes to epinephrine and norepinephrine. So, and this is just showing that response. So the autonomic nervous system is automatic. Like it says there, it's not entirely independent. It is influenced sometimes even by higher level activities. So some of that fight or flight response, if I said, okay, you're going to have to public speak in front of the whole class of 100 people, your autonomic nervous system is going to kick in. But it is due to something that was coming from your your higher level areas there, so from the cerebrum. So conscious activities can influence the autonomic nervous system. Sometimes they talk about biofeedback and deep breathing. That's another way that you can, with the central nervous system, influence the autonomic nervous system. And again, this shows you kind of some of these main areas. Conscious activities through the hypothalamus in the cerebrum can affect the hypothalamus, can affect that autonomic nervous system. The hypothalamus is controlling most of this autonomic nervous system, and a lot of reflex centers are located in the brainstem, and really that spinal cord is acting as, in some cases, a reflex center for certain things, but also as a conduit for some of these effects to be able to take place. So I think this is our last slide here, so we will move on, and the next chapter we'll be getting into is going to be the endocrine system.